How glorious can God's forgiveness be? How great it is to be back in the loving arms of the Lord Almighty. Today we will talk about how God restores the fortunes of Israel according to the verses in Ezekiel 39:27 to 29. It says, "When I have brought them back from the nations and have gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. For though I send them into exile among the nations, I will gather them on their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the people of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord." After the outpouring of God's wrath to His people in Israel for their sin and unfaithfulness to God, where God scattered them to many nations, so many of them died and lost everything that God has given them. God allowed big nations like Babylon to literally slaughter His erring people and to take them to exile. Why? Because Israel was hard-headed, foolish, idolatrous, and incapable of obedience to the sovereign Lord's will and guidance. Now the Lord is ready to display His glory among nations. This time, the nations who had hurt and destroy His people will see the punishment God will inflict them. God has tasked Ezekiel to prophesy God in fellowship with His restored people. In this prophecy, there are three things that God declared. Number one, He will bring back His people who were held captives and in exile after the fall of Jerusalem and Judah. God willed that after they have borne their shame and all their unfaithfulness, He will bring them back to their own lands, leaving no one behind. Number two, God will no longer hide His face from His people. The completeness of this work would be the true meaning of God's grace. And number three, God will pour out His Spirit on the house of Israel, and this is another form of God's grace, where the Spirit of God becomes their strength in their obedience to the Lord. What are the implications of these promises? It was sin that caused God to hide His face, and now grace will be given to keep them out of sin and to engage them to constant obedience so that God may rejoice over them to do them good in the end. Now, what are the lessons we can learn from this? One is that in this final moment gives God the chance to be seen as faithful to Israel. That God is always constantly faithful even when we are not. That in circumstances like this, God is setting His glory among nations. That the house of Israel will know that the Lord is their God. And lastly, we can learn that God is sovereign and omnipotent in everything, in everywhere, and with everyone. Dear Emmanuelites, we just learned today how powerful God is, and He will never condone and forget our unfaithfulness, idolatry, and disobedience. It is high time we go back into God's loving arms and forget our own selfish acts, thinking that we can do all things and that we are greater than God. It's so bad, because actually and honestly, we are not. We are at the mercy of God's love, blessing, grace, and mercy every day. We should never forget about this. Bye everyone. Happy weekend.